We are recording. So welcome to our discussion on the Prelude. I think it's because it was my video, I think I'll go first. I apologise for going on and on in that video. It seemed to get longer and longer because there was so much I wanted to say. The first half you don't need to worry about too much, it's context. The second half is more useful, I think. Three things I want to say before I hand over to my colleagues. First of all, this poem is it's unfair to compare it with the other ones because it's not a poem on its own. It's an extract from a much longer poem, and so you can't really compare it to, say, Ozymandias, which is a nice self-contained little sonnet. You know, this is supposed to be read as part of a much longer story. And so the lake that Wordsworth talks about here is also the lake he talks about later on, where he goes ice skating in the middle of winter. It's also the lake there he witnesses some of the adults from his village pulling out a drowned man. So it's a lake full of memories and really powerful experiences. It's not just this one moment. The other thing I want to talk about is that this is a poem that's got this other layer. It's all about kind of the poet's imagination and his reading of Shakespeare and his reading of Greek mythology. That's all in there too. So that adds kind of another layer. And also it's really symbolic, because I think that lake isn't just a lake. I think that's a symbol for his mind. And I think the mountain is maybe a symbol of his imagination, and the stars perhaps are symbolic of his kind of connection to something larger and deeper, the mystery and wonder of the universe, I think he called it later on in the poem. So it's not just a poem about a young boy steering a boat. I think there's lots and lots of other things going on, which maybe we can talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you there, sir. I was reading something this morning, and it talked about how, and it was certainly a different perspective that I'd had from what I'd had beforehand, and it talks about how the writing of the Prelude itself, the whole Prelude, was a test in fitness of the poet to write poetry of a great length, and that it really is a testament to that. What I love about the poem, and those of you who've been taught by me and those of you who know me, I have a real predilection for the darker side of life, shall we say. And for me, I enjoy the story of the Prelude just as a story to begin with, because it's this sort of, it sets you up, doesn't it, like any classic horror movie does, of a dark night, but a romantic setting, about to go out on this little journey, rowing into your boat, and all of a sudden this big beast-like thing rises from the darkness and, essentially chases him home, and he's totally impacted, totally affected. He's completely changed by this event in a way. So I enjoy just that kind of one layer story to begin with, but I certainly appreciate the bigger connections that we'll talk about.
I mean, I've said to the other English teachers, I don't really enjoy this poem as much as, War Photographer or Remains. I like the ones that are based on war, something, very concrete, because this is so kind of abstract and there's so many layers to it. I find that quite difficult, and I think pupils find that quite difficult. And whenever I've taught this in the past, you explain the story and pupils say, what? He's scared of a hill? It's that kind of, and I'm like, yes, but, there are other layers to it. And I find it quite difficult because it's so, because there are all those interpretations, but I don't really like it, to be honest. I much prefer kind of the war poems, the Charge of the Light Brigade, Remains, those kind of poems than this.
Yeah, this one certainly falls more completely under the idea of power rather than conflict, doesn't it? Although we could talk about inner conflict and conflict of the mind and things like that, certainly, I think more confidently we would perhaps talk about this in an exam question that dealt with just a power of nature, power of the mind, power of memory. Perhaps those sort of train of thinking questions would certainly be something that you could talk about the Prelude with. And I think what's nice about the Prelude, and why we can put it within our Magnificent Seven, is it's got some absolutely fantastic imagery moments. It's got loads of technical stuff that links back to power and those ideas that, you know, we can take into our arsenal as we go into the exam to talk about and show off our knowledge, really, because you know, that's part and parcel of what we're doing. We're showing off our knowledge in an exam about things that we've learned about, and something like the Prelude has got so much in there to talk about that you could dazzle your examiner with lots of poetic terminology, lots of quite deep thinking, but actually, you know, we've covered that, and we know that we've got some confidence behind the thinking of it. And I understand, Mr. Jones, why you would certainly say that it's very different to the ones that you enjoy, because I think it does fall under that bit more atmospherical, bit more fantastical poetry, doesn't it? But I don't know, it's what you enjoy. I know Mr. Layton certainly enjoys it.
Yeah, and I was thinking, I know it's a boring thing. Well, I've not read the full Prelude since I was at university, and even then, to be honest, I think I didn't probably read it very much. But I've been reading it this week, and it is a really interesting story. It's, you know, a really honest life laid bare on the page, and it's utterly remarkable, I think. And I was thinking really that some of the other poems in this anthology just wouldn't have been written if it wasn't for Wordsworth. So, you know, the idea that Simon Armitage thinks that it's an ordinary soldier's experience of war are worthwhile things to write about in poetry comes from Wordsworth.
Yeah.
You know, the kamikaze, the idea that the power of nature can turn a character's mind round, and you know, that comes from Wordsworth. So, with the exception of perhaps William Blake and maybe Shelley, all of the other poems in that anthology exist because of this poem.
Yeah, in your video you talked about it being seen or considered the first modern poem, and I think it really does lend itself to those ideas. The fact that it's in that blank verse as well, that ordinary way of speaking, that these things happen to ordinary people, and ordinary people can have big events happen to them, I think portrays across all the poems that we've looked at so far.
And the interesting thing about blank verse is that it's the language of Shakespeare, so it's the language of like soliloquies and thinking inside what's going on in someone's mind, but it's also the language of epic poetry, like John Milton's Paradise Lost, and that's the language of great battles and heroes and quests. And what he's doing is he's saying, my great quest, my great battle is inside me.
I mean, I think it's autobiographical, isn't it? You know, this event really happened to Wordsworth because he grew up, didn't he, in the area of the Lake District. So I think he's based it on an event that really happened to him. So we've got this sort of first-person narrative, this tale of you know, going onto the lake and, you know, witnessing this peak that has such a huge impact on him. And, you know, it's powerful, it's scary nature, and, you know, it affects him afterwards, doesn't it? You know, it troubles him. He has nightmares about it afterwards, and it keeps coming back to him, what he's witnessed. So I think there's a autobiographical element to it because of obviously where he's grown up and that.
Yeah, definitely. I think when I was looking at it earlier, you know, it talks about the Lake District, and we can see that imagery within the nature that's portrayed within the poem's descriptions. But I also think that the death of his parents is almost perhaps part of this darkness that he relates to the Lake District, and perhaps that's what builds into this, or part of this moment of the bestial kind of representation that comes from the darkness in the mountains.
Because this poem is, I think, that black mountain, that shadow represents death, doesn't it? And this is a poem about him coming to terms with that grief and loss. So he's leaving his childhood innocence behind and rowing across this lake, confronting this sense that not only is life full of death, but he will one day die too. So even when he goes back and he says he crosses the meadows, which, you know, you might, sorry, the phone's going off. You know, you might associate with kind of summer's days and life. It's haunted by this sense that life will come to an end, which is, you know, a bit depressing, let's face it, but also it's a truth we all have to kind of come to terms with, isn't it?
And the colour is stripped out of the poem, isn't it? It actually says no colours of green or green fields, but huge and mighty forms, no pleasant images of trees. You know, he is very aware, isn't he, of what life can lead to.
Yeah, and it starts, I mean, the start of the poem, he's quite confident, isn't he, the narrator, and it's quite very positive, and the description is very positive of the scenery around him. And then there's kind of like a Volta with the word when from behind the craggy steep. So that word when, I think, is the real turning point, the Volta of the poem. And then we get all the sort of the darkness and the negativity and the links to, you know, the idea of death and being troubled. And so there is a definite, you know, two parts to the poem, isn't there, I think?
Yeah. Yeah, very much.
I think
so.
as well, with his loss of confidence, he's showing that he's got so much more to learn about himself and about the world and about nature, and that's where his memories have left him. So he started off confident, then obviously his memories have come back, and then he gets to the point of realizing that he doesn't know everything about the world, and maybe he's not this great knowledgeable person that he thought he was going into it.
Yeah, it's about maturity and growth, isn't it? And this idea of, you know, when we're young, we think we know it all, don't we? But then there is a moment where we realise that actually maturity is about continued growth and forever learning. And I think what's important is the fact that he recognises how much gravity, how much weight that realisation has itself. You know, that he is developing and growing, and that ultimately we all die, and that in itself kind of makes him see himself as almost insignificant in the world of everything. That, you know, humans are just a drop into the ocean, aren't they?
Because I think it's really significant that he's on his own, first of all, and throughout the prelude he has these experiences when he's on his own, and also the word still is repeated a number of times in this poem, and still has two meanings, really. It has a number of meanings, but two meanings here. First of all, still as in it's still happening, but also still as in stillness. And there's something about stopping on your own that helps you kind of be open to these kind of experiences. And I think that's what Words was saying, is that, you know, it only happens when I'm on my own, when I'm away from kind of the hurly-burly of life, and I'm open to this kind of experience.
So this is one of the things I think that people find the most difficult, is this idea of him being on his own. Because if we look at the very, very first line of our poem, it actually says, one summer evening, open brackets, led by her, close brackets. Now, that would suggest to, you know, any reader that there is somebody else there leading him down to the lake, leading him to steal the little boat, those kind of things. But we've quite confidently said he's on his own. So who is her?
Well,
nature personified. Nature, sort of leading him into this situation, taking control of him, leading him to, you know, what he's going to learn about life and about death, etc. So I would say it's nature personified in that first line.
And it's significant that it's her. Nature is a female, isn't it? You know, and Wordsworth, you know, lived in the time of, you know, very patriarchal time. You know, he's very much sort of a man's sort of man. You know, he's sort of, you know, walking up big rugged mountains on his own and things. But he's really in touch with this other side of himself, this stereotypically kind of more natural, more emotional side. And I think that's what nature represents.
I think that oxymoron where it says troubled pleasure kind of represents the two feelings of nature as well. You know, he gets pleasure from it, but he also is troubled by it in this experience. It could also represent his guilt that he feels. You know, he's sneaking this boat away. He feels troubled by what he's doing because it's not his boat, but he also feels pleasure to be out in this beautiful scenic environment.
Yeah,
so
he's always marred the moment, hasn't he, by the stealing of the boat, this beautiful, perfect moment, and he's had to steal the boat to get to it.
Yeah, and then it obviously, you know, there's pleasure in the moment, seeing the scenery around him that's all beautiful, but there is trouble and that trouble sort of is reflected, that word at the end where it says, we're a trouble to my dreams. So that repetition of trouble, he's disturbed by it, he's never going to escape it. It's repeated a couple of times, you know, it affects him afterwards.
Yeah. The idea of foreshadowing is very strong, isn't it? I think here, because, and the same line as your oxymoron, Miss, he talks about the voice of the mountain echoing. And at this point, it's just an observation. It's quite light and quite, you know, happy in its tone, isn't it? He's just observing the scenery. But then, you know, not so further on after that point, this mountain, you know, rears up and frightens him.
And it's worth mentioning, I mentioned it a little bit in the video, about the Greek myth of Echo and Narcissus. And I'm always a bit conscious that maybe I'm kind of pushing these references a little bit too much, I don't know. But I think this one is true. So the story of Echo and Narcissus is that Echo is a nymph, a kind of mountain fairy, who falls in love with this very handsome character called Narcissus. But the problem is Narcissus is in love with his own reflection in a still piece of water. And kind of as punishment for kind of falling in love with the wrong person, the gods kind of turn her just into a voice that only kind of repeats what it's just heard, a literal echo. And I think Wordsworth's trying to make use of that story to kind of say something about how, you know, he's trying to echo what nature is teaching him in his own poetry. And also he sees himself something of a Narcissus kind of character in the sense that he's in love with the idea of himself being a poet. And this is kind of a lesson about, you know, hold on a minute, don't be kind of so proud, don't be so arrogant.
Yeah.
You know, you need to learn bigger lessons, really.
He is very arrogant at the start of the poem, which we've mentioned a couple of times. I think the line where he says, went heaving through the water like a swan, you know, it's boastful. He's sort of praising his rowing skills here, heaving. It's hard work, but the boat glides like a swan. So it's that sense of arrogance, you know, in his rowing ability, really. And I think that sort of links into your story there about, you know, this arrogant character who is then brought down by what he's witnessed.
I think you said as well in the video about in the revolution, when people were getting into power, they were suddenly becoming the people that they hated. And it's kind of his way of turning back around on the boat. He's turning back from being that arrogant person that he never wanted to be, and remembering that he, you know, he's not the greatest thing that ever lived. He still needs to learn lessons, and he doesn't want to go down that road that some leaders at the time were probably doing.
That's really nice, because that links very nicely with Ozymandias, doesn't it? I think. That's really nice. He's kind of saying that, almost saying that your sense of guilt, these troubled dreams, are what keep you grounded as a human being. That's what keeps you humble, and that's really nice.
Yeah, definitely. Mrs. Corfield, I'm very aware that we haven't included you in any conversations yet. You know, we know that you're not an expert because your field is science, but it would just be nice to know perhaps your opinion on what you thought of the poem, whether you enjoyed it.
Sorry if there's background noise. My daughter and friend are playing upstairs, and they were just shouting about going to the toilet a minute ago, so anything could happen. To be honest with you, I haven't looked at poetry like this since I was in school, which was circa 1996 to 98. And so when I first read it, I was a bit like, oh, this, like, for me, I like a poem that rhymes. So I was a bit like, it doesn't really make much sense. But actually, Googling it, watching Mr. Layton's video, and listening to the discussions today, it's very deep, isn't it? I was chatting to my friend about it because she was looking at it as well. We discovered that it is part of a bigger, almost like a autobiographical kind of piece of work. And he didn't actually have a title for it. He gave it to his sister, and then they came up with that. And it's after hearing the discussions now, I see how through the course of this extract, he's gone from being a boy, you know, everything's beautiful and lovely, and then something happens in his life, and like you say, the craggy, you know, huge peak, black and huge, as if his voluntary power instinct upreared its head. So something really quite powerful has happened that's changed him in some way. Yeah, it's a very powerful extract. I've actually got a new appreciation for Wordsworth, so thank you. I feel like I've learned a lot.
Excellent, yes.
Our work here is done.
It's interesting that you've pulled out that line, the huge peak, black and huge, because that's one of my favourite lines within there, and I think it's one of my favourites because, you know, he's looking at this thing that is monstrous to him, and you can see the sheer power that he feels through that line, because that language is just the most basic, the most simple of adjectives, and you think Wordsworth is one of our greatest literary poets. He could probably have come up with better words than huge peak, black huge. These are very limited, very, you know, young almost, but it's almost as if he's been left at a loss of words by what happens. That he's been, you know, he's struggled just to get those very basics. So when you talk about power and the feeling of the power of this event, you can talk about that using that quotation and talking about the simplistic adjectives that basically do the job in only the way that he can at that particular moment.
Which is a really nice link to Remains, isn't it? Because a similar thing happens there.
Yeah.
And both kind of poems are told as an anecdote. And the difference here is that this isn't split up into stanzas. You know, this is one long verse paragraph, isn't it? And
yes.
You know, Mrs. Jones talks about the Volta. I think there's a number of Voltas in this poem. There's a number. It changes direction all the time, doesn't it? So you got the black peak. That's a change. And then later on, he talks, well, you know, as I'm kind of wandering home, it all comes back to me and it troubles me. And that's another turning point. So it's almost like Wordsworth is trying to mimic the way people think in their memories, and people don't remember things in a straight line, do they? They change and they chop and change directions all the time.
Linking back to what Miss Grant said about the simple words with huge peak, black and huge, then it goes on to say upreared its head. I really like that personification there of that phrase, that, you know, the peak or the mountain is so threatening, it's so massive. You know, it's a force to be reckoned with. So whatever it is that he is describing, whether it's a literal mountain or it's something that's happened to him, you know, this is something of great magnitude, isn't it?
Yeah. And we see that verb use, don't we, again, when he talks about the mountain, like you said there, Miss, with the personification. He talks about it just 2 lines later, towering up. You know, there's movement here, isn't there? When he looks at this mountain, there is something that is moving, and there's a life to it that fills him with fear.
And what I like as well is that the mountain blocks his view of the stars. So at the start of it, he says, "Oh, you know, it's just the skies above me," and there's this real sense of kind of almost oneness with his surroundings. And then this thing, whatever it is, whether it's in his head or you know, whatever it is, has kind of stopped his thinking. He can no longer contemplate the kind of unity of nature and his place in the world, because it just shadows out everything.
Yeah.
And that links to the line that do not live like living men. You know, it shadows living men. You know, they cannot live a normal life because nature is so powerful, and men are just, you know, minute and insignificant in contrast to nature. So it affects them.
You know, when he comes back, you know, initially when he gets back, he thinks he's going to be safe. He thinks it will be over, doesn't he, when he talks about the covert of the willow tree. But very, very quickly, we see that is untrue. And he talks about in grave and serious mood. You know, that word grave, we can really look at the layers of meaning there, because in one sense, it links to that idea of seriousness. To be grave is very serious. But also you've got that obvious link to what we were talking about earlier with the idea of death linked to grave. You know, I've talked about this when you look at chapter 10 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I think Dr. Jekyll talks about having to put a grave face on to hide how he really feels, you know, and those ideas are linked in a similar way there. And I think that, you know, he thinks he's safe, and then very, very quickly it turns, doesn't it? And he, you know, that impact just follows him home and for a number of days on.
And of course,
I was going to say, I actually wrote Jekyll and Hyde down on my little paper when I was writing. You said it.
and of course, willow trees are sometimes called weeping willow trees.
Yes.
You know, so they themselves are associated with kind of sadness.
Yeah, that's a nice one. I've never thought about it that way. Yeah.
But it is, I mean, it's a great poem to compare to obviously Kamikaze and Ozymandias, because both of them deal with nature, don't they? So I think, you know, looking at comparing, this is a great poem for that.
Absolutely. And for poems that are not in our Magnificent Seven, we might look at things like Storm on the Island. That's a good one. And perhaps even Exposure.
I thought, yeah.
Yeah,
I thought,
my favourite. Sorry.
I thought Bayonet Charge. You know, that moment where he sees the rabbit and the rabbit's running across the battlefield.
Yes.
So, you know, something about the power of nature, the vulnerability.
The merciless ice winds. That's Bayonet Charge.
No, that's Exposure, because it's
I'm getting confused now.
I love Exposure.
They're all the same.
I'm in a world of poetry.
Yeah, I like all the war ones. Yeah, that's about the weather, isn't it? Affecting soldiers.
Yeah. So there's plenty of poetry that if we really focused in on this one from our Magnificent Seven, we could link to lots of other outside poems with confidence. And even if one comes up out of the others, you know this one really well. And that's why we've created the Magnificent Seven out of the 14, to give you that confidence to talk about them, whether they're the named poem or whether you can link them to the named poem. You've always got a fallback. So, let me just have a look. I'm just looking at my copy of the poem to the side of me.
I wrote down as well about the semantic field that Mr. Layton mentioned in the video.
Yes, it's lovely, that negative field, isn't it?
Yes, Miss, it is. We know you like the dark stuff. Like, it's wonderful, all that negativity. But yeah, I think that really, like, throwing all of that in there in those, you know, in the last part of the poem, just really sets the reader to know exactly what frame of mind he is in. Obviously, it's his narrative, so we know it's about him. I think it's really easy to see as well. Obviously, you've got the words like, what have we got? Solitude, darkness, desertion. There's just so many, isn't there?
Yeah, and followed up just after that collection of fantastically wonderful words, we've got another repetition of Huge, haven't we? Just pulling us back to how the power of his fear is enduring and long lasting, and he still is having difficulty comprehending it. You know, Mr. Layton referred it back to Remains earlier, and what we're talking about there is where he talks about the guts being inside out, wasn't it? You know, that the almost colloquial language used in Remains is similar here with this very basic language to just demonstrate just how seriously he's been impacted by what he's seen and what's happened and what he's thought at that time.
And it's a really nice contrast with earlier on in the poem where he uses that wonderfully poetic language. My favourite line in the poem is where he talks about the small circles glittering idly in the moon until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. And, you know, how different is that in terms of language to there's no colour, everything's depressing, you know, at the end. You know, that's a beautiful, you can picture that as a visual image, you know, the light on the lake. And also light is often used as a symbol for kind of wisdom and knowledge, isn't it? So the idea he gets a glimpse of it and then it disappears, it seems to me lovely.
Do you think that has to do with the fact that he thought that everybody should be educated, and how that would make you, you know, be able to, for people to use their imagination more, possibly?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And also Wordsworth believed that education wasn't just confined to school. education was total, and nature had a really important part of
Yeah.
that.
This
So-
idea of freedom and creativity, wasn't it?
Yeah. So, you know, this idea that, you know, those little glimpses of knowledge can come in a schoolroom when you're reading, you know, your Greek myths, but they can also come when you're out in nature on your own in the dark. It's all part of how you grow.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just responding to a message from Simon. He says he's going to go off and watch the video, and then he will come back to watching this video.
Do you know how long the video is?
Probably not. I'm just telling him he'll need to watch this video again.
Just wait till season 2.
No, I did like this poem because from watching Mr. Layton's video, I a lot of perspectives I hadn't seen taught before, because I've never taught this poem to anybody. I've seen a few teachers do it before, but I really liked it. It came across very like dream state, like he was going from the dream into a nightmare, rather than, you know, reality being set. Reality seemed to be a bit all over the place for him. But that's what he's learning from, and obviously at the end he has the reflection of what how he feels of how nature is. So yeah, I just never really seen it from a dream-like state before.
Yeah, I like that idea, from dream to nightmare. Yeah, it works. And it's almost like Mr. Layton said earlier, this idea of, you know, the way we remember things, we don't remember things in, you know, in a logical way, do we? We remember them in these kind of dreamlike ways, and we add our own interpretations to memories, don't we?
Yeah.
And, you know, and it's important to remember, as Mrs. Jones said earlier on, you know, this is a real landscape that he really inhabited. He really did experience these things, but then he's trying to tell us about them in using this very poetic language of dreams and nightmares.
Yeah. So this week we've talked about the Prelude, and you can see that we love the Prelude, including Mrs. Jones. But what we wanted to do now is, because we're heading into our last week next week, don't tell anybody, we wanted to do something slightly different for our task this week, to give you a little bit more challenge, but also a little bit more time. So on Friday, you'll have noticed from some of the emails coming around that it's a slightly different day for you guys, because it's the Life After Lockdown day. So we won't be running our own session on Friday. You'll be expected to join in with the Life After Lockdown activities, and that's absolutely fine. Okay. We will be sending out the Seneca work, and we will be sending out the Kahoot work, and we'll be sending out some links to GCSE Pod as well for you, so that you can do the work connected there. But what we wanted to do with you for the last week is we wanted to work on actually writing and responding to a question, and then next Friday leading our final session after the normal ones we do with the Q&A and stuff for our final poem next week, leading a Friday session next week with you, which looks at writing and how to write an essay and an actual example of bits and pieces that we're asking you to prepare for in advance. So Mr. Layton, you've done some work on the question, haven't you, that we wanted them to answer. So would you like to introduce the question?
I do. I forgot to bring it up. Let me bring it up. So just have a little bit of a
chat between ourselves.
Yeah, while I bring it up.
So just using thumbs up, guys. How are we feeling about the poem? Can they do a thumbs down on this?
No, just do it. Oh no, you can't, because you haven't got your webcams on. You could do the clap as a thumbs down, couldn't you?
So a thumbs up if you've got, you know, some good. Let's rag it. Let's go for, if we're green, let's go thumbs up. If we're a red, we go a clap. What else can they do? I have no idea.
There are some other, I don't know at the moment.
Oh, actually, why don't we just do the chat? Can you put red, amber, or green?
That's easier.
That's easier. That would help. Just so we've got a bit of an overview of how you're feeling about the Prelude. We've got an amber from Jay.
We've got lots of amber.
Ambers. So what is it that we're unsure about? Because now would be the time to ask the questions while we're all here. Oh, lots of Amber. So now would be the time to ask the questions. What is it that you're unsure about? Is there something? Oh, we've got a greenish. That's nice. Greenish. What's the colour between amber and green, Miss Caulfield? You're the scientist. Could you make up a colour?
Between amber and green.
Snamber.
Bramber.
Grumber.
Well, yellow, because amber's kind of orangey.
You remember yellow. You remember that colour.
Yeah.
From school.
If you think about Roy G. Biv, Richard of York.
Perhaps you were away the day they did yellow, I think.
Jay, I think lots of people probably feel that for quite some time. Yeah.
I totally feel that way, Jay. As I said, when I first read it, I was like, what? But the more you read it and the more you discuss it, I think you start to get a vibe of what he was thinking when he wrote it, especially that last bit where he says about, a trouble to my dreams. So he started it quite nice, a summer evening, but by the end of it, he's like Miss Bannister said, he's having nightmares about it all. So,
yeah. Like Miss Caulfield said, the way to treat poetry is like a story. That's all they are. They're a poet trying to say something, but they don't want to say it just out. They want to say it and get us to work at getting it. We have to put some effort in to understand it because, we're all lazy and that's what they're trying to challenge. It's about thinking about word choices. It's about thinking about techniques. Why have they used those words? Why have they used those techniques? What is the impact on me? Why do I feel that way? And why do they want me to feel that way? So don't be afraid of poetry is what we're trying to say. And be free to talk about them, be free to go and have a look. We've sent out resources, but like Miss Caulfield's done, she's gone on this morning and she's had a bit of a Google around the poems and she's had a look at what other people have said and what other people have done. And that's a really good way of getting a bigger comprehension of what's going on.
That's a really nice comment from Ella there.
Yes,
Ella. A lot of poems start, it's gone now, a lot of poems start nice and then but then the character loses control, learns something, and it becomes more unstructured and unstable. That's a really nice observation, isn't it? Yeah.
That's what happens in life, and like
the older you get, the more unstable you get.
Exactly.
Mr. Leighton, we must be really unstable.
I'm just losing it now. Like Miss Jones said, there's so many layers to this poem. You could come at it from so many aspects. But yeah, they do start to get unstable, Ella. Good notice. And you'll see that with your teachers as well.
Towards the end of lockdown, more unstable.
Can I share the screen now and show the question?
Absolutely.
Bearing in mind my internet is a bit tricky at the moment, but I will try and share the screen. Poetry comparison grid, share the screen. Something's happening. There you go. Thank goodness it wasn't my bank statement or anything like that. So compare the ways the poets explore ideas about the power of memories in the Prelude and one other poem from Power and Conflict. And I think we've kind of tried to give you a few pointers about some of the poems that you might want to think about first.
So you'll recognise the planning sheet because we've been working with this planning sheet now over the last few weeks. So this should be no different in any way, shape or form to what you've done so far. So our advice would be to highlight the keywords in the question, first of all, and then you choose your linked poem. So we've given you the Prelude. So poem 1, even though it says Ozymandias in the planning sheet, Mr. Leighton, I'll change that to send that out to you.
Does it? Oh, sorry.
Poem 1 is
now.
the Prelude. And poem 2 will be a poem that you choose. So it can be any poem of the poems that we've looked at so far. So Ozymandias, War Photographer, Remains or Kamikaze. Okay, so the second poem needs to be one of those 4. And we've tried, as Mr. Layton said, to kind of direct you today to places in which you might go. So the first box, the overall link, you're just saying something, a line or 2, which links to the idea of the power of memories in the Prelude, and then the same as you move across to the right-hand side box for your second poem. So those are going to help you produce your opening paragraph once you start writing. Then you've got down the left-hand side your 5 boxes. You know, we've suggested 5 because we're gearing us at the moment, because we're year 9 and we're at our starting point. We're thinking about that grade 5 pass, aren't we, to aim for before we really start to develop as we move into year 10 and 11 towards aiming at that top end of the grading. So we're looking at 5 key ideas broken down into 3 that are linked to language, 1 that's linked to structure, and 1 that's linked to context. And we've included context on there because you have to talk about context to get those mark schemes moving you through the levels. If you don't talk about context, you get what's called capped. That's what English teachers would call it. It means you get stuck in a lower level. Even though your language might be really good and high, you can't get out of the lower levels unless you're ticking all the boxes in each of those levels. And context is one of those bullet points. So you've got to talk about context. So 3 things that link to the power of memory in the Prelude to do with language. What quotation would you choose? What would you say about it? And perhaps a technique or 2. Then something about the structure that links to the idea of the power of memory. And then something about context. And then all you're doing with your second chosen poem is you are doing that for your choice. So finding those 3 language, 1 structure, 1 context. And remember thinking about how the poems might link, whether they're similar, whether they're different, whether they start in a similar way and then branch out in different ways. That's absolutely fine. But starting to think about how you might talk about them using those comparative connectives. So you might wish to add a separate, add a middle column there, your own pencil work, and just add in some connectives that you might want to use as you're doing. So the planning sheet is as you've done before, and we would like you to have a go at that planning sheet for that question. But that's really what we've done so far. So we want to move you 1 step further. So the next step is starting to pull together a written response. Now, by no means, in any way, shape or form, are we expecting you to hand in the most perfect answer, okay? We're not under any illusion that we're working in very different conditions and that we're at a starting point. But a starting point needs to give us something to work towards, doesn't it? So what we would like from you is for you to build a short response using your point, evidence, analyse, explain, link structures that you've done with your teachers in class to talk about this question. How is this poem talking about the power of memories, and link it to your second poem? So myself and Mr. Layton have talked about how we like to balance. So we talk about point A for poem 1 and point A for poem 2. And we would certainly champion that approach. But at the moment, for confidence, if you wish to talk about poem 1 and then compare it to poem 2, we are more than happy for you to use that as a starting point as well for us to develop forward. Okay, so what we're asking from you, if I just go back through that, and Mr. Layton will send this all out on an email and it will be available on the link to the Q&A as well. We do advise you to come back and look at the Q&A because obviously we knew the question, so we've been trying to direct you towards some of the things that we would want you to talk about. So what we want you to do is complete the planning sheet and a short written response, probably 5 paragraphs, okay, approximately, talking about 2 poems. So overall, you'll talk about 10 points across your poems, okay? And what we would like you to do is we would like you to send us your planning sheet completed and your written response together by Tuesday. And what we will then do is we will use all of the great work that you send us and we will put together a review and comment and feedback session live Friday morning next week, and we'll send all the timings and all the links out to you as we would normally do. Okay, have I missed anything, Mrs. Jones, Mr. Layton, Miss Bannister?
No, only that the work on London will come out as normal. So there'll be a PowerPoint with me talking over it, which will come out on Monday, and it will be on the website as usual.
Yes, and we're still doing our Q&A on Wednesday at 2. That will never change. So we're still doing that, and Miss really likes London, so we're looking forward to that. And we'll still be doing the Kahoot, the Seneca, and the GCSE pod work on London as well. So there'll be plenty for you to do, but it is the last week. So, you know, work hard, and then you can play hard, can't you, when you're 6 weeks off? And that's the benefit, isn't it, of doing this now? So again, if we just say, now would be the time to ask any questions. You can ask them in the chat button, or you can ask them if you want to mute your microphone and just ask. We're more than happy to. And just give me a thumbs up if you understand what we're asking you to do. So the planning sheet and then a short written response. Fab, Caris, brilliant, lots of thumbs up. So it shouldn't be too much of a step forward from what we've been doing so far. It's basically just pulling together your thinking from your planning sheet and putting it into a bit more of a formalised paragraph. And we are going to really work on giving you some great feedback next Friday, using some of the examples of the work that you sent us. And we've already been so impressed by the work that you've sent us. It's been fantastic, some of the planning and some of the effort that's gone into the planning. We've been blown away by it. So we are really, really hopeful and really looking forward to seeing your thoughts in a longer written format. So,
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
No, that's it. I was going to say, I'm pretty much said all I want to.
All I wanted to say is, from the work that I've seen, you've got yourself on a really good footing for year 10. I know people have talked about, you know, how people have missed time because of lockdown. I don't feel that from you guys, from the work you've sent in. I think you've really engaged with this. So thank you.
Okay, so last minute for any questions to come through on the group chat. While we're waiting for that, can we just say to Mrs. Caulfield a big thank you. We really appreciated you coming in and giving us your thoughts.
Great comments. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's opened my eyes to poetry, so thank you.
There'll be a test later.
If you could send your essay in by Tuesday, Miss, we would appreciate it.
I might need an extension. I'm making an octopus.
Oh, wow.
Oh, I thought they were brilliant, Miss, when I saw your pictures. I definitely want one. They're amazing.
I need to get some more wool. I need to make a Shrewsbury Academy squid.
I think we're pretty much done on questions. So thanks, guys. It's been another fantastic Wednesday afternoon. And,
thanks for having me.
No problem at all.
Thank
we will
you.
see. Well, I'll see you guys. Well, you know, normal.
Yeah.
Happy day. And the rest of you, year 9, I'll see you next Wednesday. Thank you.
Brilliant. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.